In a casual interview exchange, a filmmaker joked about work schedules and long breaks between projects, a moment that seemed ordinary at the time. Yet years later, moments like these would feel haunting when Hollywood Truth magazine published a startling headline in March 2007 that shook the entertainment world. The article claimed that a private journal attributed to legendary actor Burt Lancaster had surfaced, containing reflections on some of the most powerful figures of Hollywood's golden age. Rather than a memoir, it was described as a deeply personal account, an attempt by an aging star to reconcile admiration, disappointment, and moral conflict in an industry he loved but no longer fully recognized. Whether the journal was literal, symbolic, or editorially interpreted, it reignited long-standing debates about power, ego, and accountability in classic Hollywood. Kirk Douglas, Power, Ambition, and Intimidation. Kirk Douglas remains one of the most commanding figures in film history, celebrated for his intensity and refusal to play safe roles. Yet within the industry, stories long circulated about his fierce ambition and uncompromising personality. Some colleagues described him as inspiring, others as overwhelming, but nearly all agreed he was relentless. The journal attributed to Lancaster portrays Douglas not as a villain, but as a man who embodied the darker side of unchecked power, someone who believed dominance was the price of survival in a ruthless system. In this telling, Douglas becomes a symbol of how Hollywood rewarded aggression and how success often blurred the line between leadership and intimidation. Natalie Wood, Fragility and Control. Natalie Wood's legacy is inseparable from grace, vulnerability, and emotional depth on screen. Yet off-screen, she was also known for being fiercely protective of her career. In an era where actresses had little control, Wood was said to fight relentlessly for respect, sometimes using dramatic gestures to be heard in male-dominated spaces. The journal's interpretation frames her not as malicious, but as someone who learned early that influence required strategy. Her tragic death remains a subject of speculation, but modern reflection urges caution, recognizing how fame, pressure, and fear shaped behavior without reducing a complex woman to rumor. Mickey Rooney, Fame at Too Young an Age. Mickey Rooney's life stands as one of Hollywood's most sobering cautionary tales. Thrust into fame as a child, he grew up under constant scrutiny with little emotional guidance. Industry accounts describe a man who oscillated between generosity and volatility, charm and sharpness. The journal's portrayal suggests that Rooney's harshness toward others reflected unresolved pain rather than cruelty for its own sake. In later years, Rooney himself spoke openly about regret, failed marriages, and the toll of early fame, offering a reminder that stardom can distort development when it arrives before maturity. Elizabeth Taylor, Stardom Under a Microscope. Elizabeth Taylor was more than an actress. She was an institution. With immense fame came constant attention, creative clashes, and emotional exhaustion. Stories of on-set tension during large productions like Cleopatra are well documented, often stemming from illness, pressure, and unprecedented public scrutiny. The journal reframes Taylor's reputed outbursts not as entitlement, but as the consequence of carrying impossible expectations. She navigated a system that both worshipped and exploited her, leaving behind a legacy marked by strength, vulnerability, and contradiction. Spencer Tracy, Genius and Inner Turmoil. Spencer Tracy's performances radiated warmth and moral authority, yet his private struggles were no secret. Alcoholism, health issues, and emotional conflict followed him throughout his career. Colleagues described both kindness and unpredictability, depending on the day. The journal's depiction leans into the idea that Tracy's volatility reflected deep internal battles rather than malice. His story reminds us that brilliance and suffering often coexist, especially in an era when mental health support was nearly non-existent. James Stewart, the quiet perfectionist. James Stewart represented integrity to generations of moviegoers, but behind the scenes, he was known as a meticulous professional with high standards. Some peers interpreted this as judgment, others as discipline. The journal suggests Stewart believed deeply in responsibility and order, sometimes to a fault. Rather than painting him as cruel, the narrative explores how quiet authority can feel intimidating in collaborative environments. Stewart's life reflects the tension between personal values and collective creativity. Marilyn Monroe. Vulnerability in the spotlight. Marilyn Monroe's image has been endlessly analyzed, often overlooking the reality of her emotional fragility and lack of protection within the studio system. Production delays and on-set challenges were real, but so were the pressures she faced as a woman whose worth was constantly scrutinized. The journal portrays Monroe as someone struggling to assert autonomy in a system that infantilized her. Her story is less about manipulation and more about the cost of fame without support, where vulnerability was misread as disruption. Errol Flynn. Excess and consequence. Errol Flynn lived as extravagantly as he acted, embracing a lifestyle that later generations would view as reckless. His reputation for excess, while often romanticized, also carried serious consequences for himself and others. The journal's reflection treats Flynn as a symbol of an industry that once celebrated indulgence without accountability. His decline serves as a reminder that charisma does not protect against self-destruction. Bing Crosby, a complicated family legacy. Bing Crosby's public persona was warmth and ease, but family memoirs reveal a more complicated private life. Parenting norms of the era, combined with personal rigidity, created lasting pain within his household. Rather than condemning, the journal reflects on generational trauma and how emotional distance, when normalized, can echo through families. Crosby's story invites discussion about how cultural expectations, once excused behavior, now recognized as harmful. Gary Crosby. Growing up in shadow. Gary Crosby's struggles illustrate how childhood environments shape adulthood. His later difficulties, documented in his own words, reflect the confusion of growing up under immense pressure and discipline. The journal does not frame him as irredeemable, but as evidence that cycles of pain often repeat without intervention. His life underscores the importance of compassion and mental health awareness. Henry Fonda. Emotional distance and discipline. Henry Fonda embodied moral clarity on screen, yet his children later described a father who struggled with emotional expression. The journal explores how stoicism, once considered strength, can feel like absence to those seeking warmth. Fonda's legacy remains monumental, but his family's honesty adds dimension to the cost of emotional restraint. Jane Fonda. Conviction and controversy. Jane Fonda's activism and outspoken beliefs have long divided public opinion. The journal frames her as someone driven by conviction, sometimes clashing with those around her. While admired by supporters, her intensity could feel overwhelming to others. Her story reflects how public advocacy can strain private relationships, especially when identity and ideology collide. Joan Crawford. Discipline and fear. Joan Crawford's parenting has been debated for decades, largely shaped by her daughter's memoir. The journal approaches her legacy cautiously, acknowledging both the pain described and the era's harsh expectations. Crawford's life illustrates how control, when mistaken for care, can fracture trust. Her story continues to provoke discussion about power within families. Lucille Ball. Leadership and pressure. Lucille Ball broke barriers as a female executive in television, a role that demanded constant vigilance. The journal portrays her leadership as demanding, shaped by the fear of losing hard-won authority. While some experienced her standards as harsh, others credit her for opening doors. Her legacy reflects the complexity of pioneering spaces where success came at emotional cost. Final reflection: fame, power, and human complexity. Whether literal or symbolic, the journal attributed to Burt Lancaster offers less a list of villains and more a mirror held up to an era. Hollywood's golden age produced brilliance, but also fostered environments where power went unchecked and vulnerability went unsupported. These stories remind us that icons are human, shaped by systems larger than themselves. Understanding that complexity does not excuse harm, but it allows history to be examined with honesty, nuance, and empathy. The real lesson lies not in judgment, but in learning how far the industry and society has come, and how far it still has to go.